Conversations with Cosgrove. I am Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove, and today with me is the one, the only, the growing legend on a meteoric rise to rabbinic stardom, Rabbi Nolan Lebovitz, the senior rabbi of Valley Beth Shalom in Southern California. I have been to more bar mitzvahs as a child in his community than I can count. He received his rabbinic ordination with a master's degree from AJU's Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, a BA from USC's School of Cinema and Television, and a PhD in religion from Claremont Graduate University. He is not just the leader of Valley Beth Shalom, but he is also the author of his first book, The Case for Dual Loyalty, Healing the Divided Soul of American Jews, challenging the oldest taboo in the long history of the Jewish diaspora. Rabbi Lebovitz, can I call you Nolan?
You can absolutely call me Nolan. Thank you very much for having me, Elliot. If I can call you Elliot on air. Thank you for including me in the Park Avenue community in this way, and welcome back to Southern California. Welcome to VBS.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to be part of the Valley Beth Shalom, and hopefully whatever misdeeds I did under Rabbi Schulweiss's or then my colleague Rabbi Feinstein's leadership have long been forgotten. I have such fond memories of Ventura Boulevard, going up and down and running out of your synagogue as a child. So it's great to be in touch. And this is awesome. This is like a co-branded podcast, because we are going to put it on for the Valley Beth Shalom community as well as for the Park Avenue Synagogue community. Can I just ask, how the heck are you? How long have you been the rabbi of VBS?
3 years now. Almost 3 years.
And if someone were to ask me how I was at the 3-year moment, I wouldn't be able to remember because it was all such a blur. Are they being nice to you?
Beyond. I mean, this is the most wonderful community, and I don't know how you feel at this point in your career, but it doesn't ever feel like, to me, I've been here almost 3 years. It feels like 3 minutes or 300 years, depending on the day that you ask me, but never quite the right amount of time. Since I have been ordained, I've been forced to face COVID, school shootings, wildfires, war, not a whole lot of Talmud, which is actually what we study when you train to become a rabbi. And so oftentimes I like to broach the conversation with our good friend, Rabbi Bradley Artson, that we should get some kind of discount because I wasn't really trained to handle these kinds of things in rabbinical school. But shocking, Ziegler never offers discounts, and they don't like entertaining that conversation retroactively. I don't know if JTS is more benevolent about that kind of topic, but I have a feeling that all of the schools would kind of stand united at that front.
Well, the book that I would write, my next book, is The Things They Don't Teach You in Rabbinical School.
Right, which is everything. Which is everything outside of, like, Shabbos services and high holiday liturgy and the Talmud. And so there you go.
Yes, though I would write it, but I would never publish it. It would stay in a drawer or in a file in my saved iCloud documents. Maybe we'll co-write that book together, Rabbi. So
anytime.
Let me ask you, Nolan, because it took me about 15, 16 years to write for such a time as this on being Jewish today, post October 7th. And yet you wrote your book in the third year of your tenure, or the second year, The Case for Dual Loyalty. So really, just to trade notes before we dive into the topic itself, how the heck did you find time in your first few years to write a book like this?
The way that I explain it to people is that I've always had trouble sleeping. And so so finding time is never a problem, because I find time early in the morning when other people are usually still enjoying their rest. When I read for such a time as this, It was actually our good friend, our mutual friend, Rick Richmond, I think, who mentioned both books in one sentence in a piece that he wrote that made me think maybe I should go out there and read for such a time as this. It was after I had submitted the final manuscript of The Case for Dual Loyalty. And I was really honored because I think that we both started in a very similar place. And I think if rabbis around the country recounted the morning of October 7th in America, I think we would all share very similar stories in terms of how it unfolded. It was Chag for all of us. It was a holiday. We don't normally use electronics, and all of us found ourselves pulled into the outbreak of the war, both in terms of through personal relationships and through communal leadership. And then I think we all kind of encountered the journey uniquely to our own community.
Right. And the two books kind of track a similar path, right? Other than, and frankly, we could probably spend this entire time talking about what it's like to be an American rabbi in a time like this. But I think your book, and hopefully my book too, asks broader questions than just the trauma and or some sort of geopolitical analysis of what's going on in Israel and the Middle East, but we're actually plumbing the depths of the American Jewish soul. And my book takes its cue from the springtime festival of Purim, where Esther believed in ancient Shushan that Jews could live comfortably this hyphenated existence of blending, straddling comfortably between being, in Esther's time, a Persian and a Jew, and Esther actually means to hide one's identity. And then, of course, the hammer comes down with Haman's wicked decree, and Mordecai, by way of an emissary, says to Esther, don't think that you're going to escape this moment. Who knows if it was not for such a time as this that you've arrived at this moment. And Esther has her Esther moment and rises up as a queen, as a woman, and most importantly, as a Jew. And she saves the Jewish people. And my book, hopefully a charge for Jews in whatever capacity they can to find their own Esther moment in the face of the trauma of October 7th. Some call it a tribal moment. Some people call it an October 8th Jew, the Great Awakening. There are different names for it, but it's this reassertion of Jewish identity in the face of October 7th. I'm wondering if you could explain what is there a guiding thesis as you would frame October 7th's effect on American Jews?
Yes, I think that the guiding thesis of The Case for Dual Loyalty is that you use Esther kind of as a guiding document, and I use several passages from the 5 books of Moses, from the Torah, as a document. The thesis being a section out of the book of Numbers, towards the end of the book of Numbers. We're on this long journey from Egypt to the Promised Land, and right when we get to the wrong side of the Jordan River, and Moses is about to express the greatest, most famous sermon in the history of Judaism that we know of as the book of Deuteronomy. Right before the end of the book of Numbers, 2.5 tribes come to Moses and say, as it turns out, we really like the school systems on this side of the Jordan River. We really like our businesses on this side of the Jordan River, and we like the sports teams. We don't want to change our sports teams. And so we're going to stay in diaspora. And I use that as a window into the lens of who we are. And Moses, he reacts the way that we would all react as leaders. This isn't the plan. And so he makes them pledge. He makes them pledge in that moment that when their brothers and sisters need them inside the land, they'll show up and fight as well. And that kind of motif repeats again and again in the Torah. I use the Jacob's ladder image in one of my chapters to show that, we're all essentially Jacob. We're known as Bnei Yisrael. Jacob gets the name of Israel. We're known as the children of Israel. Everything that Jacob encounters in Jacob's journey, we encounter in our journey again and again and again. And so he actually ventures out of the land into diaspora. And we're told that he has this ladder dream where the angels come up and go down up the ladder. And Rashi interprets that, the great sage Rashi interprets that as almost like a line shift in hockey. There's two different teams of angels. One line has to get off the ice for the other line to come in. That's how different diaspora is from the land of Israel. But God's message is actually very different. God's message is that God will be everywhere. And we didn't realize that. You didn't think that God could travel with us everywhere. And so we received that message about diaspora as Jacob encounters this journey. And I basically painted the image that the latter image of encountering diaspora has always been the relationship between Israel and the diaspora before. One pole being Israel and one pole being the diaspora. But the important part, the significant element of the latter that we don't really focus on are the rungs in between. For Israel to ascend the rungs and become the fullest self, we actually need to live in the in-between, and those rungs need to be as strong as possible. And so I focus not on a ladder. In this three-dimensional digital world, I explain that the ladder image needs to be updated into a kind of double helix strand, which is also a ladder, just constantly revolving around one another. And so Israel and the diaspora desperately need each other now more than ever. That's what's become clear since October 7th. And an October 8th Jew understands that the attack on the kibbutzim in the Otef or in the Gaza envelope wasn't actually an attack just on those communities. It began a jihadist effort on the entire people, on our entire people, global Jewry at large, right? Because if it was just an attack on Nachal Oz and Kibbutz Be'eri and Kfar Aza, and I can name all of the kibbutzim that we've visited, we wouldn't have seen marches in Manhattan. We wouldn't have seen Columbia and UCLA descend into filth and madness and everything that was involved in those encampments. And so I think that an October 8th Jew understands that there is no difference anymore between what goes on there and what goes on here. Whatever passport a Jew carries in this world, they should prioritize their Jewish identity at this point much higher. And we all carry multiple identities. I talk about it in my book. You talk about it in your book. This kind of multi-layered identity is a reality of modernity. It's just that right now, in this moment, post-October 7th, I make the case that wherever your Jewish identity is on that ladder, we have to raise it higher. For some people, that'll go all the way to the top. For other people, I might just convince them to raise it one rung or two. But for the sake of our entire people, everybody has to raise it up.
But your premise also suggests that there might have been a wrong turn along the way for American Jewry, right? That there might have been a moment where we should have been prioritizing our Jewish self, our connection to a national notion of Jewish identity as opposed to social justice or progressive values or what have you, that this is actually, God forbid, we would all choose a world without October 7th, but this is a course correction in how Jews should perceive their identities. Is that right? Was there a wrong turn along the way?
I don't know that there was a wrong term. I think that if you look at a pie chart of what American Judaism was emphasizing to a generation that was growing up, and I know it because I was raised very much in this generation, I think that Tikkun Olam as social justice, as a kind of, and again, this is a lot of colleagues take some umbrage at this explanation, but this is the way that I experienced it, is this kind of secular universalist social justice that was perhaps too large of a slice in the pie of Jewish education. And as a result, you have, and again, I could point right into your book for such a time as this, you end up in conversations with Maya, which is the chapter and the portrait that you so beautifully paint. And I think that leaves a lot of Jews of an older generation scratching their heads. Well, how does Maya get those ideas, right? So you so beautifully sketched out a portrait of Maya and Maya's disappointment in the way in which Jewish values manifest in the state of Israel. And one of those values, right, that are described is Palestinian self-determination, for example. Now, as I read it, I don't know that Palestinian self-determination is a Jewish value. Palestinian self-determination is the remnant of a universalist social justice movement here in America. I'm pretty sure that Palestinian self-determination is a Palestinian value, right? Jewish self-determination would be a Jewish value. Caring about our fellow neighbors is a Jewish value. But the idea that Jewish authorship over Palestinian self-determination would carry so much weight that it would be in some way disenfranchising for Maya, I think is a result or a product of that kind of emphasis on tikkun olam. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I'm not sure I agree with you, but I think that's what makes this conversation fun. Meaning, I think that my number 1 through 10 priorities are the well-being of the Jewish people, the sovereign state of the Jewish people, that the atrocities of October 7th should never be allowed to happen again. My war is a war with Hamas, not with the Palestinian people. My Zionism is a Zionism that believes that Jews should have the right of self-determination to be the subject of their own sentence, not the object of someone else's, and that promise of Zionism does not involve exerting power over other people, that whatever my views are or aren't regarding the Palestinian people, I think it is in the long-term self-interest of the Jewish people to make sure that the Palestinians have a place to hang their hat. And so I do believe, as an ardent Zionist, that my sense of self, my Jewish self certainly, is inextricably tied to the state of Israel. And I think the state of Israel is inextricably tied, its security, to the condition of the Palestinian people. And so by the associative property that I learned in 5th grade, my Jewish self is tied in to the Palestinian people. Not Hamas, but the Palestinian people. And which is why I always come back to it too. Whether you want to, we can quibble about, is it 2 states? Am I talking sovereignty? Am I talking self-determination? Right? We can have geopolitics, people talk about that. But ultimately, I think there's a human need for everyone to be able to hang their hat on a place. And nobody knows that better than the Jewish people.
So I agree with the vast majority of what you just said. And my point in the book is just to say that the prioritization of otherhood, of neighbor over family, results in a way of looking at the world in which you see the fallout of a post-October 7th world, and your number 1 priority is no longer about the well-being of your family. But
well, that I agree with you entirely, right? A sense of justice that's inclusive of every person other than your own kin is not justice. Then we can go into, on the American side of this conversation, a DEI policy that's inclusive of every subcategory of humanity other than your own category. It strikes me as not inclusive and otherwise. So
that's right. So, and very much, and part of my book is also that, since it's written for the American Jewish community, what we're going through in this moment is not just about our Jewish identity, it's about American identity as well. And so In many ways, I believe that my kids learned, just to use it as an example, the counter Thanksgiving narrative before they were ever given an opportunity to fall in love with the Thanksgiving narrative. Now, whether or not we understand the Thanksgiving narrative to be a fairy tale, that narrative never got a fair shake for my kids, who came home at a very, very young age to say, why are we doing all of this? This makes no sense. We're celebrating a genocide. Now, if early childhood education, and I'm not talking about preschool, but early as youngsters, if that education if we don't play it out past that grade level to understand that what we're doing is we're placing this kind of toxicity in education about our national identity as Americans, and I'm not just talking about Jews, I'm talking about everybody here, I think it becomes very dangerous if we don't understand the result, especially how this plays out a decade or two. And I think that the low level pride in being American also kind of tempers the American Jewish ability to have pride in being Jewish, or especially standing alongside Israel, because I think that so much of what America and Israel share foundationally is a similar narrative, similar values, and so they end up corrupting both sides. And so the social justice movement in Tikkun Olam wasn't just a reflection of what we were teaching, or our movement was teaching, or American Judaism was teaching. It was really reflective of an outlook or perspective of a generation, in terms of a misappropriation in that pie chart of values that we all hold, in terms of a multiplicity of values.
All right. Yeah. Sometimes I use the analogy of we're both conservative rabbis, of biblical criticism.
Yes.
That you have a colleague, Alex Sinclair, who once wrote an article about this, that you don't teach multiple authorship of Torah to first graders. You teach the text, you teach a love of text, and at the appropriate educational level, once that foundational, anchoring in the sanctity of the text, then you can start introducing, certainly you and I as conservative rabbis, that there are counterclaims to that traditional notion. And ultimately, the hope is that when that child arrives at university or otherwise, they are not hearing it for the very first time, that there are multiple narratives going. So as applied to our love of Israel, of course, it's a complicated world. And as I say to my congregants nearly every week, the Middle East is not the Upper East Side, right? We have to introduce this at the appropriate level, which we're actively doing with our teens in the congregation, but we're doing it only insofar and in as long as we have introduced that foundational Avat Zion, Avat Israel, love of Zion, love of Israel, the idea of Zionism as the right of Jews to self-determination in their indigenous homeland. It's very painful to me to see the Zionist narrative not being spoken proudly and loudly, which I believe it should be. It's interesting, in your book and my book, we both talk about the double helix, but I think a little differently. I talk about the springtime festival of Passover, with both has a sense of vigilance and self-defense. In every generation, a new Pharaoh arises to destroy us that we have to be on guard against. But at the same time, the whole message of the Passover story is all who are hungry come and eat. That we were once strangers in a strange land, therefore we know the heart of the stranger. That I think it's this notion that I think we're presented with, that you have to choose one strand over the other. And my contention is they're actually both indigenous to not just the Haggadah, but to the Jewish project as a whole.
I couldn't agree more. It feels as though so many of our high schoolers, who one would think would apply to the schools that we applied to growing up, are now choosing different schools to apply to, aren't going to be spending their college years in Los Angeles or New York, but rather in Texas and Tennessee and Florida and Georgia and I could name a few other states, Missouri. These seem to be the places where every Jewish kid considers today. Do you think that the Upper East Side or, LA, I think we have a lot in common between our communities. Do you think they're going to look the same a couple decades from now as they do today? Because I argue in the book that I don't think they will look. I think just like I came out to LA to go to college and ended up staying here and falling in love with LA, and it's a lot easier to root for the Dodgers than it is for the Cubs. You've traveled eastward in stages.
I have no dual loyalties there. I only root for the Dodgers.
I understand. Well, right now it's easier to root for the Dodgers than the Yankees, and I know that's not going to play well with your base. But what do you think is going to be, if you had to look into a crystal ball? And neither one of us are able to predict the future, of course. But what kind of lesson will be learned, or what kind of life experience will be learned by this next generation who will grow up in a post-October 7th world, do you think?
Look, I could just simply say, as a data point, I could say there are a lot more kids applying to Florida schools and Texas schools and Tennessee schools than there are when I first arrived here 17 years ago. Just if I were to map out the data, no question in mind. And those kids, I mean, you can't get into UT Austin right now.
No, it's impossible. A kid told me the other day, UT Austin's harder to get into than Harvard, and the parents immediately said, for good reason. Now, if that's the way that Jewish families are thinking, then the landscape of American Judaism is going to change.
Yeah, look, I have a congregant who shall remain nameless, but who believes that the writing is on the wall in the blue states right now, that there's going to be a migration of Jewish communities to red states because you go where it's more hospitable. The awkward fact, though, is that the toxic and polarized nature of American politics are that the Jewish community is being forced and foisted into this position where they need to choose between their traditional progressive values, whatever, whether it's social justice, the environment, fight against poverty, reproductive rights, you name it. And now those who would champion those values are not hospitable to whether it's Israel or the concern for the well-being of the Jewish community. I think that's a terrible turn of events. I think just to be clear, I think it would be awful if the New York community and the LA community were so diminished as a result. I think that American Jews, whether you be an American Jewish, a Democratic American Jew or a Republican American Jew, to keep the Jewish part as the subject of that identity, I think that I would argue it becomes all the more important that you exercise the Jewish aspect of your identity in whatever party you're in. And so whether your ideal candidate is Richie Torres, right, or whether your ideal candidate was, Marco Rubio, just to pick a left and a right, I think it becomes more and more important for us to distinguish ourselves in terms of what our expectations are of Jews within that party. And that brings us back to a sense of peoplehood. So my congregation, I believe, is increasingly purple. And I would argue that I think that more and more congregations as a result of October 7th are becoming more purple. And it's not that all Jews are voting one way or the other. I think that Israel is moving up the priority, the list of priorities, and that's what elections see people prioritize. That's all that it is. I think most Jews, and
Elliot, I'd love to hear your. I think most Jews, if you put them together, our staunchest Republicans and our staunchest Democrats would prioritize the same 10 topics. The question is how they prioritize those 10 topics to determine how they vote. Because I think that most Jewish people that I meet around the country, their identity emanates from the same place. Their choices from a similar narrative. I don't know. I had the pleasure of knowing your parents because I was an intern and taught Torah at the Torah teaching table for many, many years at the synagogue where you grew up. And
the other LA synagogue.
Your dad speaks with a Scottish accent, right? And my grandparents would speak with heavy Eastern European Yiddish accents, and I believe that their stories are very similar. Just like we have a large Persian community here in Los Angeles. They come from a different part of the world. Story is very similar in terms of how they derive their values.
One of the most moving parts of your book was a personal narrative, Luba, and you tell the story. I was wondering if, just for the sake of my listeners, I'm sure your community knows this story, but if you could share both the origin story, how it impacted you, and then when you were a bar mitzvah kid on your first Israel trip, of the reappearance of that family, and really more just sort of how that shaped your own Jewish self.
I grew up hearing the story of, I'm named after my grandfather, Papa Nathan, my mom's father, who passed away when my mom was in her 20s. And Papa Nathan was from Lodz. My grandma Faye, who we married, was from Lodz. Papa Nathan was married before the Shoah. All 4 of my grandparents are survivors of the Shoah. And Papa Nathan lost his first wife, and he believed that he lost his first daughter, Luba, during the Shoah, and was told that when he came back looking for them. Everybody had come back from the camps, and people told different stories about the different people that they saw brutally victimized during the Shoah. And so he summoned the strength somehow, and I can never really appreciate, I think none of us can, the strength that it takes for people to summon this kind of faith in humanity to begin again, and married again, and intended to start a family again. And he married my grandma Faye in an apartment with 4 Jewish men holding a tallis over their heads. They expressed their love for one another like weddings today. It's a dirty secret that they did not have a rabbi present at the wedding. It's not good for our job security, for people to hear this part of the story, but you don't actually require Jewish professionals to do the ceremony. And so he broke a glass, and they were married while really in hiding after the war, which is what we don't talk about. Is after the war in Poland, there were Soviet soldiers coming through and raping and pillaging, and even as they were destroying and liberating concentration camps, they were still, really expressing their kind of disdain for Jews and their personal opinions in that way. And so they were in hiding in Lodz in an apartment, and then moved into a displaced persons camp in Germany where my aunt was born. And they acquired tickets to go to America on a ship. And through a series of events, they weren't allowed to go on the first ship. They weren't allowed to go on the second ship due to illness, due to this, due to that. And during that waiting period, that prolonged waiting period, my great aunt, Luba, Papa Nathan's daughter from before the Shoah, showed up and found him in the DP camp.
He had survived.
She had survived. She saw her mother murdered, and she survived the Shoah. He was astonished, overwhelmed, overjoyed. My grandmother, Grandma Faye, who's not too dissimilar in age, she's just a little bit older than Luba, was overjoyed. And instantly they offered to figure out how to get her a ticket to join them on the journey to America, at which point she refused. And she said that she had no part in going to America. She didn't want to be part of the next iteration of diaspora. She wanted to go with all of the young people. She was a late teenager at that point, to go to pre-state Israel and fight. So Papa Nathan smuggled her through the mountains before, only nights before leaving for America, smuggled her through the mountain range to North Italy and got her on one of the Exodus ships. And she ended up immigrating to Israel, was arrested immediately as soon as she set foot on the soil of our ancestral homeland, and she was, let's say, escorted by the British authorities to a different kind of camp behind chain link fence and barbed wire in Cyprus. And it was in that camp that she met her husband. They stood under a talus, okay, in this camp in Cyprus. And it was what they used to call their honeymoon when they showed up to Israel for the first time in 1947-48. And when they touched the land for the first time, they kissed that beach and were handed 2 rifles and told to board a bus to head to Yad Mordechai, which was the line between Israel and Egypt. It was the final battle in 48 that actually held the line. And she was there with youngsters that understood that they were going to die in that sand, but they weren't going to leave. And they knew the world, and they knew that there was nowhere that they were going to go. So there was nowhere for them to go back to, because they weren't, the secret that my family's held for many years is that because they weren't European. Because my grandparents never thought for one second, when people asked us where we're from, they always taught us to never say we were from Poland. Polish people told us we weren't wanted there, and to never say we were from Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakians told us that we weren't wanted there. So this is kind of an ethos of how we were raised as a family, is that we don't descend from Poland. We don't descend from Czechoslovakia. We're not white Europeans like them. They're white Europeans, and we were never part of that story. We were never accepted. We had suffered anti-Semitism the entire time. We were always othered there. And the place where we were originally from is this ancestral homeland far away. When I was 12 years old, I took my first trip to Israel. It was part of a synagogue mission. And I always look back at that and understand the importance of rabbinic leadership, calling a family and saying it's time that you travel to Israel, because it changed my life. In 1991, we were at a hotel in Tel Aviv, dressed formally, about to encounter this Israeli family that we had never met before, but only heard the folklore and the legends surrounding them. And we sat, as every person who visits Israel understands, we sat on one side of a long table in a lobby, in a hotel lobby, and waited patiently for the other side of the family to show up. And it was like the meeting of 2 delegations at a formal foreign policy. And the doors opened, and in walked Liba and her husband and all of their and her children, and they looked taller, tanner, stronger. And how could this possibly have happened in only 1 or 2 generations, that we look so different, considering we come from the same stock? And as I explain in the book, I asked that question, or my mom asked the question at the table, but it was, she turned to me and my brother and my sister, who were all sitting there on our side of the table, and said that she thinks it's the water in Israel. If we want to look like that, we should come onto their side of the table, and we would instantly transform into these different looking people. And it's always stayed with me that there is kind of this difference of expectation. There is this kind of separation. But I have to tell you that I think that to a large extent, that the separation that I feared was growing, and this narrative of kind of we're on 2 separate courses, our Israeli family and our American family. I think that that's largely been done away with since October 7th. I think that I took my son there on the first VBS mission. VBS has had 3 volunteer missions to Israel since October 7th. I took my 13-year-old son, at that time he was 12, 6 or 7 weeks after the start of the war, and we made sandwiches on the front lines for soldiers who were coming off. We were at We were at a place called Shokedah, which was right on the border with Gaza. My iPhone actually, to great offense to where I was going, warned me several times that I'd crossed into a war zone. I should turn back and go back to safety. I didn't know that iPhones had that warning. And actually, I think that experience, and we've done similar things with all of our kids, I think it changes their life because they realize that those soldiers don't think that they're just fighting for Israel. And those soldiers think that they're fighting for the future of the Jewish people. And that my kids understand that they're part of the same promise made by those 2.5 tribes, that when our brothers and sisters call out from inside the land that they need help, it's actually our responsibility to show up and help. Now that's been part of kind of my entire upbringing, that outlook. And it's complicated in this moment, and this is a whole other episode for us to talk about. We showed up in 1991 as the uncle. The American Jewish side of the family was the wealthy uncle to bear gifts to our nephews. In a very patronizing way, we opened a piece of luggage and handed out Game Boys to all of our cousins. And this was something they didn't have. Like, they were so thrilled to get these Game Boys. And we were so generous to hand out Game Boys and took so much pride in giving them something like that. And today there is no Game Boy to be given. If you have the experience of going to Tel Aviv and Herzliya and Jerusalem, you see every car possible is being driven. Everything that is in America is in Israel. And in many ways, we are now either equals, or you can understand the relationship has shifted, and they are in some ways the uncle and we are in some ways the nephew. And certainly I think in their minds, the relationship has shifted, and yet the generosity must persist. So this is a strange transition, I think, in the relationship, because in the wake of October 7th, Israel needed help, needed support. We showed up. And I think in that way, every Jewish community in this country should be proud of itself for showing up. And now as we begin to understand the next chapter of Jewish life, which is going to be a post-October 7th chapter, I think that the relationship between Israel and American Jewry is going to look very different than it did before October 7th.
It's a beautiful insight into your own soul, your own family history, and it's beautifully told in the book itself. I have about 8,000 follow-up questions for you.
We'll have to do another episode
of disagreement. So maybe we should take this show on the road and have a West Coast, East Coast discussion. We haven't even talked about our shared time in Chicago, but we'll get to that, please God, another time. Rabbi Nolan Lebovitz, I want to congratulate you on a really, really important book, The Case for Dual Loyalty, Healing the Divided Soul of American Jews, not just for what you say, but how you model how a conversation should happen, the places we agree, the places we disagree, but most importantly, that we share a destiny, American Jews and Israel, now and always. So thank you for your spiritual leadership of our people.
And I want to express the same gratitude, Rabbi Cosgrove, for those of us in LA who have not read For Such a Time as This, because I imagine that every Manhattan Jew has already read For Such a Time as This. For everybody in LA who has not, they absolutely should get the book today on Amazon. And I think that we should make a tradition, because I feel like in the next 4 or 5 years, Los Angeles and New York, our calendars will be intertwined in October, November, not because of the Chagim, but because I think the World Series will see our two teams meeting over and over again. And I think that we should make a tradition that our communities come together and we have some kind of dialogue to make sure that, we remain a people in spite of kind of the divisive nature of the World Series.
Divided loyalties.
Right. That's right. That's right. So thank you very much for inviting me on, and thank you for joining VBS. And I look forward to seeing you in person.